All righty. Hey, Lydia, how are you?
Hi, Julia. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's 12 on the dot, so we're going to give folks just a few minutes to jump in for the event to actually push live on LinkedIn, but I'm so excited that we get to do this today.
Me too. Me too. And Julia, where are you located again?
I am in Lakeland, Florida, which I tell folks is between Tampa and Orlando. So, folks who are joining in, drop in the chat where you're dialing in from. Lydia, where are you?
I am calling from Baton Rouge. That's
Yes.
a reference that some people might get. The home of the LSU Tigers. LSU is
Right.
about 2 miles away from my house. So, and I think it's like a balmy 90 degrees right now. So, love it. It's full
Everywhere is
summer.
I know everywhere is in that heat wave right now. I'm like looking at the folks in New York and all over. I do not envy them. And yeah, oh, we've got Liana from the suburbs of Philly. Love it.
Whoop whoop! What up, Liana?
I say to people, I'm from the Chicago suburbs, and I feel like the difference of Florida and Chicago is like in Florida, you have to live inside all summer, and in Chicago, you have to live inside all winter
That's
because
right.
it's just unbearable in the summer in Florida. It's like I seriously get my kids into the car in the morning, and I'm like, that's enough. I got to be back inside. Oh, awesome.
Definitely feel
See
that.
some other folks from Atlassian, Liz from Seattle. Great. Love it. I'm also going to ask people to drop into the chat if, as they're joining us, a quick question. How do you define microlearning? So as you're joining, that's going to be our
Definitely a buzzword that I feel like has been around for, I don't know, at least a decade now.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I know whenever I first started working in the microlearning space early this year, I was attempting to try to define it and give it a real definition. So definitely curious what other people think.
Yeah, yeah. We'll let people kind of filter some of that in. I think we can go ahead and get started, and people will trickle in and probably, pop in and out as we go, but we're so excited for people to be. Oh, awesome. We've got Guy from the UK. Hey, Guy. Awesome. Former colleague of mine. Good to see you. So yeah, please feel free to drop where you're from. I want to get us kind of started. I've done these with a handful of people, but you're my second customer that I'm getting to do this with. And so I'm so excited. We've been working together for a little over 6 months now, and it's been really fun. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit. I think it's always interesting for people to hear how you've gotten into your role. I talk with a lot of people in cybersecurity, but you're specifically in L&D. And so I'd love to hear your career path and journey and how you got to the role you're in today.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Julia, for having me on. I know we've had a lot of impassioned conversations about learning just in our touch points. So I'm excited to maybe share some stuff that we've learned and how we at Atlassian have leveraged Haekka to enable our support engineers. But a little bit about my background. I actually started in art history. I really wanted to be a museum curator or a professor. And I got 2 degrees. I got my master's in undergrad at LSU. And so I spent a lot of time in art museums, interning, volunteering. And then when I got to grad school, I started teaching some undergrad survey classes. And that's where I really got my first taste of teaching and the designing learning experiences. After I graduated, I continued to teach both in person and online. And I was always trying to push beyond what I had gotten as an art history student, which were lots of mind-numbing lecture presentations that were just slideshows. And so I wanted to move beyond that. And so a lot of my classes, for example, when we talked about the Bayeux tapestry, we would build comic books. And whenever we talked about the Renaissance, I would pull out a bunch of fashion magazines and they would collage different features of Northern and Southern Renaissance altarpieces. So I've always been really passionate about getting people to really get hands-on learning and think outside of the box with my teaching approaches. At the same time, in the background, I was also working on LSU's campus as a learning specialist for student athletes and supporting learners who may have come from high school with IEPs. And then I also managed a large-scale tutorial program and got to train tutors. So in that experience, I call it like teaching people how to learn and then also teaching people how to teach. And I learned so much from that.
Oh,
and then I pivoted a little bit in 2018. LSU Online was spun up, and I was hired as a learning experience designer. And that's where I got to really apply a lot of the practical understanding of instructional design that I'd gotten from teaching online and in person, and really getting to understand the theory behind it, but also the user experience design principles about creating modern learning that's behavior focused, that is in an online format, that helps learners reach their outcomes and full potential. From there, I moved over into the corporate enablement space. I started out working at a smaller fintech company where I worked mostly to revamp our user onboarding for the software that we offered. And I used a tool called WalkMe, which is a digital adoption platform. And if you're familiar with it at all, it essentially embeds learning experiences into the UI. And so it's point of need learning for the users that really helps enable them in their moments of need. And so that's where I really, started experimenting with microlearning. What's the smallest amount of information to support that learning need in the moment? And then a couple years ago, I think it's 2.5 years ago, I got what has really been my dream job at Atlassian. And if you're not familiar, we make Confluence, Jira, Bitbucket. We support, folks who create software and beyond. I know we often tout that we helped NASA get into space a little bit with some of our software. So right now I work in the customer support services organization in the learning and development team. And I feel like all of my experiences have really led me here. We have a very fast moving global audience of support engineers and managers. And we've been trying to move away from one and done training modalities where you just kind of publish the training and you pray that it sticks, into using tools like Haekka to reinforce knowledge, shift behaviors, and scale through light kind of targeted learning experiences. So that's where I am now.
It's not a small task. You help enable a lot of people, and especially like you said, I mean, Atlassian has several products. You're shipping new features all the time. So
Absolutely.
There's a lot for folks to keep up to speed with. And then you also layer in just that it's a large organization, and there's, just procedural changes and enablement that has to happen all the time. So yeah, I think it's so cool. I always love hearing about creative folks. I think especially in L&D, that creative nature and
the liberal arts to tech pipeline that we talked about.
Yes, exactly.
There's a lot of creatives that end up here, and I love to see it.
Yeah. I'm noticing there's a few people. Okay, Ethan popped in his definition of microlearning, but let's talk a little bit more about kind of we'll dig in still more on the microlearning specifically, but you started to tease out you're using Haekka today. Can you tell us a little bit about when you started at Atlassian, how you ended up? There's a really cool program that I'm excited for people to hear about, because I think there's other organizations that should learn from it. But you kind of started out, you had a project that you got to take on, and it helped you to Haekka. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So when I first joined Atlassian, I remember during our onboarding, they let us know about a program called Ship It. And it's a twice yearly internal hackathon where any Atlassian can pitch an idea. So it could be for an improvement to a tooling, a customer request that hasn't been prioritized, or something that's going to measurably improve the way that we work. They can pitch it. They can assemble a team of Atlassians and ship it within 24 hours. And so when I first joined, I had been working on a revamped version of our onboarding experience for support engineers. And one thing that really stuck with me was that they only took it one time. They would take, it was 8 modules that were pretty lengthy. Yeah. And a lot of them were going through it in a week or two, and then they would never get exposure to those principles that focused on, ticket handling, what we call the Atlassian voice, how we talk to our customers, how we provide legendary support. And they weren't getting any of that reinforced in any systematic way after the training. And so I really wanted to experiment with something called spaced repetition, which is really, really valuable for adult learning and getting folks to retain information and combat what's called Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. So if you don't use it, you lose it. And so I actually hacked together my own Slack-based microlearning delivery system that used Slack workflows and Google Sheets. It was very scrappy. It was very manual, but it worked. We got to a minimum viable product, and it got a lot of attention at Atlassian. We got 9th in the Americas voting, because everyone gets to vote on the best projects. And I remember in the page, somebody commented and was like, "Have you heard of a tool called Haekka?" And I looked into it, and they were like, "We have access to this tool. We subscribe to this tool." And I was like, "Wait, did I just build like a version of Haekka that was not as good? And how can I leverage this tool for, this broader initiative of trying to get that spaced repetition and learning?" And so we started kind of piloting it in a few different places on our team, trying to see how it landed. Did it blend into the flow of work? And then since then, we've been using it in a bunch of microlearning pilots, as well as a function of change management, to what you mentioned earlier, when there's a process change or a new tool that gets rolled out and we need to enable our support engineers quickly, but also not take them off of the queue for a large amount of time, just to have them walk through a passive training that they're likely not going to retain if it's not reinforced in little bits over an amount of time. So since then, we've been using it in a few different projects and work streams, and had a lot of success, and have absolutely loved using the tool.
What a perfect serendipitous way to be able to use something that makes your life easier. And yeah, I love that story. I think the other thing that's just really interesting with your career trajectory and your time as an instructor in the classroom, and then helping folks who struggle, I think you have this really empathetic view of the learner, but you also, have that academia side of you as well as a professional. And so I feel like you also connect really well the learning theory behind why this is a better mechanism. Because on the one hand, I think a lot of people hear about it and they're like, "Oh yeah, that seems easier." And in a lot of ways it is, right? Don't get me wrong. They don't have to log into something else. They're already in Slack. But when we talk about microlearning, separate from Haekka, there's a lot of learning principles that are studied, written about, validated, that this is a better way for adults to learn and retain information. So I think it'd be great if we could dig in, just thinking about the definitions of microlearning and the misconceptions. I think for me, while some of it makes sense in theory, I, probably a year ago would have just said sure, microlearning just needs to be, under 5 minutes and
smaller,
shorter, whatever. That's kind of the tool available. It needs to be a 2-minute video instead of 7. I don't know. So, and Ethan said, learning quickly and effectively so it doesn't take away from the work. I'm sure there are other popular definitions, but let's dig in and talk a little bit about some of the theory behind it.
Absolutely. Well, I always want to start with what microlearning is not. And before we go into the specifics of what it's not, I do want to call out where I got a lot of this information. I want to give credit where it's due. I was able to attend an ATD conference in 2024. That's the Association for Talent Development. And any L&D people who are not part of that organization, definitely recommend getting embedded there. But I got to attend Robin DeFelice's session on, it was called Making Microlearning Work, Designed for Conciseness and Context. And she highlighted a lot of these principles and talked about, I think the biggest aha moment was she talked about microlearning that you could design it as a drip campaign over time, where you're working towards skill attainment and behavior change in little bits over a longer period of time. And so you're not overwhelming your users, your learners, with this one and done training. And if designed correctly, you can actually get better outcomes with smaller learning. Now that leads into what microlearning is not. And it's not, just because it's smaller doesn't mean that it takes less time to develop and that it's thoughtless in development. I would say that's kind of the first thing that I want to emphasize here, is that you really need to be intentional about the types of learning that you are selecting microlearning for, because it is absolutely not right for every outcome. When you're thinking about learning that is complex and foundational, that involves like needs for deep discussion or coaching, microlearning is probably not going to be the best solution for that entire training concept. It can augment and support those types of training experiences, learning experiences, but it will not take the place of them. So that's all to say, like, by no means is it going to take the place of every long form instructor-led training. However, it can serve a purpose in those contexts as well. Microlearning is definitely not limited to a certain time or modality. I know when we had this conversation on our team, I had people ask the same question of just like, how long is a microlearning? What form can it take? And there were a lot of ideas. Some people said, oh, it should be no longer than 5 minutes. No, it should be no longer than 10 minutes. And it's not, I wouldn't say that it's tied to a certain length of time. I think you have to, again, go back to your learners and identify what is the smallest and largest amount of times that they can still be considered learning in the flow of work, where they're not context switching. They can take a chunk of time, 10, 15, 20 minutes, might be 30 minutes in some situations, to spend some dedicated time on learning and then return back to their everyday tasks without having to take a large amount of time off the queue.
Yeah, but I think that's a helpful clarification of like, I think we can understand, like, there are things that are, I think that's a perfect definition of, there are things that are foundational. Like, you think about onboarding as an employee to a new organization, that can't all be solved through microlearning. You need some of that instructor-led content. You need some of those deep discussions that are really important for that to be conveyed effectively. So yeah, anyways, that clicks for me too. And certain things that are just going to be more complex.
Right.
Yeah, that inherently makes sense as well.
Right. I don't think we'll ever be doing, I loved Robin DeFelice in her book. She talks about, and now I can't remember his name, but the guy that landed the plane on the Hudson, about all of the preparation that goes into, all the preparation and practice and simulations that go into becoming a commercial airline pilot. Could that have been served in the form of microlearning? Probably not, and it would not have served the needs of commercial airline pilots and the safety of traveling Americans in that situation. But so there's certainly situations where it's like definitely not the most appropriate use case. And whenever folks in the business come to me and they're like, could we use Haekka for this? Could we make a microlearning for this? I really try to be precious and intentional about when we're making those decisions, because if you say microlearning yes for everything, then you are barraging your learner, your end user, with all of these disparate microlearnings, and it's actually, you're kind of cannibalizing your own success there. So you want to be really intentional about it.
Right? Like, that's the other thing of like, it doesn't, I love that you're precious with it, because I think it does. It runs the risk of, learning is so emotional, right? Mm-hmm. And to have a positive outcome from a learning exercise, we really want it to be a positive experience. And so, if it just becomes this like nagging thing that is like, oh, I have another thing I have to do from Haekka or whatever mechanism, it definitely can have the opposite effect. So I think that it is really important. And I think that crosses over for sure in so many different ways, where I feel like sometimes even with like notifications from anything, I get a bajillion HubSpot notifications, and sometimes they're really helpful, and sometimes it does turn into noise, and all of that can be configured. Anyways, but that's like, your settings configuration. That's like the instructional designer who's managing what is being sent to the user. So I think that
Yep.
is very important, that the user is kept front and center, and that their
Absolutely.
day is really valued. And I think that that's the other thing that microlearning helps organization to do, is just like really put themselves in the learner's shoes. And I think that you do that so well too. So
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's for every microlearning pilot we've done, and we call them pilots because we are iterating and experimenting, we always include a learner survey. And then up front, I always have end learners that are helping me test the solution and give me feedback before it's even released in a pilot version. So I try to keep their needs at the center, and what I think is a good training, or what I'm like, they're going to love the way that I have contextualized this problem and tried to, get them excited about this change, is not actually landing with them. And you don't know that until you spend the time to talk to them and understand what's important to them and how they want to be reached.
Yeah, I think that that's come up in some of the other conversations. I think back to my conversation with James Gilchrist and some of the other folks just in the L&D space, that it's so easy for folks to say, okay, great, let's do a training module on this. Okay, whether it's going to be like a traditional RISE or, delivered in LMS like Absorb or whatever it might be, Docebo. Oh, we have this change that's happening. Let's create a full 30-minute module. But I don't want to jump the gun too much, but you had another really good example of where you used an assessment before delivering more content. And I think that that's the other power of just being able to check in on folks. So, okay, we talked a little bit about theory. Just calling out for folks who are joining us, in the chat, we pasted a guide or a job aid from Robin DeFelice. And if you haven't read her book, there's a great book that's also linked there, Microlearning, short and sweet. So you can check
it. And it really is short and sweet. I read it in about 90 minutes while taking notes. So it's very much a professional development activity you can get squeeze in there.
Yeah. But Lydia, should we talk a little bit more about some of the use cases and where you've been able to implement microlearning in different modalities and how that's been received and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I talked about what microlearning was not, but I do just really quickly, I at least want to arrive at my definition of it based on my experience in designing it, and then reading the literature and what's out there. But I think microlearning, again, it's a strategy. But as Robin calls out in her book, it can also be a product and a campaign. So it's like a way of designing, but it can also be the product or the outcome of that design experience. And I think the big differentiator between an effective microlearning and then a longer training that's just been broken up into bits just randomly, is that you are focusing each microlearning around targeting a specific skill, task, or concept. And the question that I ask over and over again whenever someone comes to me and says, we need training on this, is always, what do they need to do differently on the job? If there's no actual behavior change or mindset shift or actions that they need to take differently, then we need to kind of go back to the root cause of like, why do you think this is a problem? And that's kind of where the use case that you just mentioned, there was a question around the way that certain support engineers were using a field in our internal support form. And there were some new definitions rolled out. And so we used Haekka to first deliver an assessment of 10 questions that were scenario-based, saying, based on this ticket, what would you mark the complexity as? And from that, we were able to get data on, do people actually need a training on this? Or are they able to, based on our 10 questions, 70% of the time, make the right apply the right complexity definition to the case. And so we found out that they actually didn't need more training. but maybe they just needed more reinforcement of those definitions, more examples. And so it ended up kind of serving two purposes of like gut checking, we don't need to do another full-scale training. And then two, it's also reinforcing some specific concepts around this new form definition.
I love that. It just made me think of something else. And I don't know that we've actually talked about this, but just having this available and having like an easy way to ask questions like that, does it also make it easier for you to like deliver that experience? Because I could imagine that if you would have just been like, okay, yeah, let's do another training on this, and then you have to spend all that time developing the training, like the time before that actually gets to the people who could use the support, it has to be way longer.
Yep. It is cut down. I will say, at least the Haekka platform, because we aren't, again, you have to be very concise, and that can also take time in crafting the lessons and the layout to reach that right amount of conciseness, but also completeness.
Yeah.
But having it in Slack limits how I guess high fidelity you can get with your design. And as learning designers, sometimes we do end up navel gazing and we're like, we're going to make this a gorgeous, beautiful design and it's going to look so polished and we're going to have all of these theming elements. And a lot of times those aren't necessary to, that actual behavior change or skill attainment. And so Haekka really forces you to strip down all of that and really look at what is the content, what's the bare minimum content, and then assessment or practice that they can get to show evidence that they have attained that skill or apply that skill. And so it has cut down our development time because we're not, one, having to go into a RISE course and add a bunch of blocks and interactives. There are, of course, the quiz questions that you can build in Haekka, but they're pretty light lift. You don't have a lot of options, so it can be good and bad. But in this case, I think it's good to simplify it. So it's cut down the development time that it would normally take for an LXD to build out a fully formed training and deliver it as well. So it's definitely for these in the right use case, in the right context. It helps, I guess, reduce that feedback, that loop time of delivery.
Yeah. But like you said, I mean, I think you said earlier, it's not always that it's faster because those assessment questions and crafting them carefully and making sure that they are that is real work that can't be shortcut or minimized. It's not easy. Like I was working on something and I was trying to write some assessment questions and I find it very hard. I'm not an instructional designer at all. And it's a very creative and special skill to ask questions in a clear and quality way.
Yeah. And so for the audience, I think whenever I'm approaching these requests or there's an idea for a training or there's a need for a training, this is straight from Robin DeFelice's book, but she talks about these 4 purpose questions to define the intent of the training. Are you supplementing the current training by offering different ways to engage the learner? So in the case of the unified onboarding, that practice scenario where they're able to go in and apply the Atlassian voice to a real customer problem, it was giving them it was supplementing that content in a different way. Are you augmenting current learning materials and providing an opportunity to build confidence in performing tasks? Will it reinforce training content that is often used and vital for job performance? Or will it remediate poor or incorrect performance and behaviors? And so if you can say yes to one of these things, it helps direct the way that you design that learning experience. And again, to her point that the best microlearning is designed as a campaign, it's not just a one and done. It maybe augments a instructor-led training, or it supports, one of the examples that we've used it in most recently is we had a program that was focused on frontline support managers. And it was a 6-week, 2-hour program. During that 6 weeks, each of the weeks was a 2-hour session. And we already had so much content packed into those sessions because we had a lot of whiteboarding activities, a lot of breakout rooms. We had guest speakers come in. We had discussions. We had a lot of hands-on learning going on there. And we kind of did a flipped classroom approach where we used Haekka to deliver some of the content that we wanted them to review beforehand. And if you look at Robin Day Felice's that job aid, she talks about the preparatory use case where we tied it to a larger training event, that workshop. And by sending them, by assigning them this Haekka where it's like, watch these videos on this specific topic, you're going to start thinking about these discussion questions. How does this match up with your own experience and your team's experience, and come ready to discuss? When it was time for us to have that conversation, everyone had watched the same videos, had the same background, and it really equalized participation where we did it. I mean, there's always that awkward pause when you're like, all right, who wants to kick off the discussion? But I feel like it was, people felt more prepared and were able to share more insights because they had that time to prepare beforehand and really start to deeply think about the topics that we wanted to discuss. So you definitely want to start with those 4 purpose questions. And then she also talks about these different use case descriptions. So I say, pick your P. She has these 5 Ps about the pensive use case where you're honing critical thinking skills, performance, supporting in the moment, persuasive, post-instruction, practice-based, and preparatory. And she talks about how you could have multiple Ps that apply to each one, but it really helped me think about all of the different applications that microlearning can have to support more traditional forms of training and not take the place of it. So I really love that. And I think I attended this session and started experimenting with Haekka. And since then, I've really tried to be intentional about how I've designed with the Ps and asking the 4 purpose questions to make sure that microlearning does what it's supposed to.
Well, and like you said, I really love it as a prep because I think we talk about how a lot of folks, or at least some learners, are just not going to be as inclined to participate when they don't have time to think, especially like more introverted people.
Absolutely.
They need to reflect and chew on something before they have something that they want to share. And so I think that, to your point, it brings folks into that instructor or group training in a more meaningful way. And I kind of, I know myself, like I'm a little, maybe it's because I'm in sales. I'm just like, oh, whatever. I'm comfortable in that setting, but I also have tried as I've gotten older to recognize that and pull back. So I'm not dominating a virtual classroom or whatnot.
Right.
But, that takes time. And so I think that's such a great way for people to have that opportunity to reflect, and having those kind of prep questions and like, hey, think about this within your team and what have you,
Right.
to bring everybody in a more powerful way. And I mean, of course, I think, again, when I think of sales enablement training that I've participated in, and then of course I deal in security training, there's so many concepts that just need that either practical application for it to really sink in, or they just need, they need more repetition so that you can really, you just keep it top of mind because of that Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And there's so many things, especially when you're talking about onboarding. Like, I think everybody describes onboarding as like drinking from a fire hose. So if you can have some of that information trickled back, I think it's so
right. And sometimes you got to dust off a skill. You might have just completely nailed, customer responses and customer handling in a specific scenario, but maybe you haven't seen that scenario come up in 6 months, a year.
really,
You sometimes you got to dust off those skills and get some practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I'm calling out folks in the chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop questions over here. I'm going to remind y'all if you have them. It's been fun to see people pop in and out. There's still some folks there. So don't be shy. But it's fun to see the reactions as we're chugging along, because I know a lot of this has been really, really helpful. So, okay, let's talk a little bit more about, I know that you've been kind of like sprinkling in a bunch of the use cases so far, but are there any others where you felt like, you've had some other big wins or feedback from from end users and whatnot. So what other unique ways have you been able to deliver this after you've really rolled up your sleeves with this methodology?
Yeah. I think one of the first kind of cross department initiative that we used Haekka for was a rollout of a new internal tool for our support engineers. Mm-hmm. And we used Haekka in this training as a function of change management. We really wanted to, we use the ADKAR model of change management, but so we wanted to really drive awareness that this new tooling change was coming. We wanted to drive desire of like, why do you want to use this? Because a lot of it relied on some more manual updates for support engineers to make, but it was to the benefit of the whole team. And so there was a little bit of that, we talk about the effective domain of learning, of like changing an attitude of like, yes, this is going to take me maybe 5 extra minutes a day, but it's going to be to the benefit of the team, and I will see a real impact of this. Mm-hmm. So we really wanted to raise awareness, desire, and then knowledge and ability to use the tool. And of course, you want reinforcement at the end. But we used Haekka to roll out this initial user onboarding to get them exposed to what this new tool was. Haekka has a way to embed Loom videos, which is our internal like YouTube platform that we use at Atlassian. So they're able to watch a demo of the video, walk through the main features, and then the tool relied on them to make status updates throughout the day. And because of the nature of their work and how many different teams and products we support, we have a lot of different status transitions that they would need to use in certain scenarios. And so at the end, after reviewing the statuses, we really wanted to focus on that behavior change of them being able to choose the correct status in the moment. And so we developed just a few short scenario-based questions. You're doing this, what status should you use? And then they're able to get immediate feedback. Yep, you nailed it. Or nope, you'd actually want to use this status because of this reason. And so that really helped get them ready. And as a result, we didn't use it with the first few rollouts of this tool, but we used it with the last one. And we saw that folks were making more frequent status updates and with more granularity. And that's what we were wanting to see, because we really focused the micro learning, not only about like this tool is coming and this is why it's changing, but the real behavior change of like, we want you to correctly use these statuses day one.
Yeah. I think that's when you're in a corporate environment and I'll speak for myself as an end user, it is really important that you can share, and you have to kind of change hearts and minds along with teaching the skill. And so I love that was top of mind, because it is hard sometimes when you're like, oh, I think this has been fine. I've been doing it this way. It was whatever, but it's like giving folks that whole picture. And I think that ties into so many learning outcomes, whether it's like compliance or security or whatever, when it comes to like harassment training, just like helping people understand the why behind it is it can't be understated. And I think that, learners sometimes need that. I know that there have been times with change management processes where I'm like, if I just knew why, I'd be more.
Right. Yeah. Just tell me why you're making me do this new thing that's going to take more of my time.
Yeah, exactly. I was a problem sales rep at one of my jobs because I didn't like getting engineers for POCs. And so anyways, but I think there were probably too many POC accounts opened up. And, now that I'm in a different role, I'm like, okay, I can understand that was probably a bigger headache, and that's why they needed the engineers. But I just always felt like, but why? I can do this on my own. So anyways, I'll call myself out as a problem in that way in some scenarios. I think I've gotten better, but
I can talk about one of the other ways, because I think something you said about the audience and especially at a large tech company like Atlassian, the audience that we're serving are extremely capable, extremely intelligent, high executive functioning individuals. Otherwise, they wouldn't be at our company. And so I think that there's, we had a new process, and it was called a manager queue that we were having tickets that were reaching certain risk thresholds get alerted to a specific place in our manager's UI, and they would have to go through a new review process to review that ticket, follow up with the engineer if needed, and then mark off what were the next steps, because it was giving us data about what are the proper follow through or follow up actions to take to mitigate risk in certain problem areas of support tickets. And then we also wanted managers to have more eyes on what tickets could go south.
Yeah.
Again, we know managers are extremely capable. They manage large teams. And so we use Haekka to roll out this training, which it wasn't like step 1, click on this button to reveal the manager queue. It was like, here's a quick demo of the UI. Here's the expectations. Here's some best practices. And then we're going to ask you some scenario-based questions around those specific behaviors of when to review, what the SLAs were, or the expected turnaround time on some of those reviews, and then the different fields, the data fields that we needed them to fill out so that we got important data to make better improvements in the business on our end. And so again, it was somewhat light lift. We're again telling them, you are capable. You don't need a full-scale training on this one change. We're going to tell you why, we're going to tell you how, and we're going to give you some best practices around it. And again, we had, with the Haekka training, we had follow up on, I think, 75 or 77% of the tickets that came through the queue within the first 2 weeks. So that really shows high adoption of this new process and tool, and the training was just the right amount to get them equipped to take part in this change.
Yeah. This is like a commercial for the Atlassian support team too. Like,
we work with some amazing folks. We really do.
Yeah. But this made me think of something else too, that I think, before you had Haekka, before you kind of like did this Ship It project, what other tactics or vehicles to deliver this kind of information? Like, did you have a feeling of like, okay, this would be too much for an absorbed module, or this is not enough for an absorbed module. But in that case, would you just lean on like email, Slack notifications, and maybe like a Confluence page or something like that? Like you're kind of like using the wiki and then a few other channels how else would you have done this? Like for somebody who doesn't have Haekka,
Right.
I'll give them that coaching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's where my publish and pray tactics, I think were utilized, where you try to communicate in the various Slack channels, like, hey, this is changing. Here's the page. The page can also be instructional. And Confluence allows you to like embed Google Forms. So if you wanted to put a quiz in there, you could. But what I love so much about Haekka is the trackability and the traceability of it, that you can assign it to a group of people. And there is that accountability piece that, for better or worse, there's a carrot approach and there's a stick approach. And oftentimes carrot first, but maybe with a little bit of stick to make sure folks complete training and know, hey, this is a priority. This is why this is an assigned mandatory training. And so I think it really, and again, you want to be intentional about when you decide to go that route, because there are some initiatives where, again, if there's not a huge behavior change or a big shift in processes that you're trying to target, maybe it's just updating something or they need to be aware of something, then a Slack post and a Confluence page will probably serve the need. You may not get to everyone that you want to, and then that's where you have to do follow through comms and follow ups and things like that. But sometimes that is an appropriate way, like to reach your outcome. So we still use longer form training. We use Absorb as our LMS, and so we're not getting away from those training modalities anytime soon. But this has filled a need that we had for a while in support.
Yeah. And I think the nice thing as an end user too, it's like, I have good intentions that like, if I see a Slack post and that I need to go read a wiki and whatnot, but I also like, I get overwhelmed when I look at a wiki. And so, it's just like, at least I think about some of my time at another organization where the wiki just always felt overwhelming.
Yeah.
But so I think that it also, having the tool available is, not only a stick thing, but it's also just that it's easier for the end user. It gives them that clarity of like, hey, they're going to get that notification in Haekka. Hey, this is due in this many days. We have like nice user notifications that will say things like, hey, this training is almost due. Do you want to do that now? Or do you want to snooze this and come back to it in a few hours, which is like one of my favorite things. Cause it's like,
yes,
not right now, but yes, tell me.
But I need a reminder. Please remind me. Yes.
Yeah.
And we are a Slack first company. So it's rare, unless you're working with customers or with external folks, we don't use email to communicate internally. However, Absorb only gives notifications to learners through email. And so when we assign out an Absorb course, they're not getting anything. And a lot of folks are not going to be checking their emails on a regular basis for those notifications. So we're closer to finding them in the flow of work by utilizing Slack. And I think we talked about this. We design a lot of these micro learnings for the last Slack to be something that they could save for later and come back to. So if there's a link to a standard operating procedure that's a part of this, or some quick tips for how to integrate this new workflow into your everyday, they can save those for later and return to those at their point of need when they need to review those types of things.
Yeah, I think that's huge, especially for organizations that use Slack. And then that can also just be part of the training of like using Haekka well, is save this. You can come back and search for this at any time. The fact that it's searchable, I'm not going back to an LMS tool to search for a leave behind like that. It gets lost in my downloads folder and, that kind of thing. So
exactly.
Yeah, the searchability is huge. Well, this has been so much fun. Is there anything else? I'm kind of like, I think that this is maybe a pretty decent stopping point. Is there anything else, any final thoughts that you would share with folks who are maybe haven't ever deployed a micro learning tactic, haven't really thought about how they might deliver things as a campaign? I don't know, aside from Robin's book, anything else that you could add or share?
Yeah. So again, remember, think about what is the specific behavior, task, or skill that you're trying to augment, reinforce, support. And is it something that can be reinforced or remediating without deep conversation, reteaching, coaching? And, if you're looking at your timeline, if it's something that needs to be turned around pretty quickly and it's just like, hey, this is what's changing, here's how it's changing, and then here's some scenarios where you might see this show up, then microlearning is a really, really good starting point for that. When you do get started with microlearning, I highly, highly recommend bringing your learners in as soon as possible. So I often identify an SME from ops, and we work together on actually writing the content. And also, like at the very beginning, when I'm bringing in the training request, what's really going on? Like, are there other underlying reasons why folks aren't able to perform this task at the level that's expected? Or why is this mistake getting made? Because it may actually not be a training problem. It may be an organizational problem. It may be a documentation problem. It may be a motivational problem that you can release 100 micro learnings, but it's still not going to solve the root cause. It's just going to be a Band-Aid. So again, think deeply about those requests. I know we talk a lot in L&D about trying to move from order taking to being consultants, and really doing needs analysis with our stakeholders to not only say like, hey, you probably don't need a training, but here's some ideas of where this problem might be coming from that you can focus on in the future, where training is not necessarily going to solve.
I love ops. That's so,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I would just say, again, take a look at Robin DeFelice's book. She does have a sort of checklist of like when it's the best suited solution. Also on that page, you'll see 7 microlearning design principles. And the first one is tool capacity. So if you don't have something like Haekka, what is another tool that you potentially could leverage that has all of the needs for your learning experience? Is there some sort of ability for feedback loop. So can they send a practice in and get feedback on it? Can they take an assessment and get feedback on it? And are you able to get data on that experience of how well they're interacting with that information? And then finally, test, rebuild, test, and test again. Oftentimes, your first draft is not going to be the final draft. So build in different ways that you can test it with trusted stakeholders and specifically learners that are going to actually be taking the training to give you that feedback. So always keep that feedback loop open.
Yeah. And I love that you guys just call it a pilot, and that just reinforces that concept. So that's great. What awesome closing out tips. This was so wonderful and fun to get to chat through all of this. Thank you again for sharing so many valuable insights. We'll have this recording available shortly so that people can grab it, and we'll be sharing it out with our customers. But thank you again. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to everybody who was able to join in live. And we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. Y'all have a great day. Feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn if you have any burning questions after this. I'm happy to try to provide an answer, or just connect and be friends.
Love that. Awesome.
All right. Y'all take care.
Bye.
Goodbye.